Hey there, welcome back to Seeds of Meaning. I'm grateful you're here. If you're new, my name is Nick Walker, and this is a space for curious minds, deep thinkers, and anyone looking to reconnect with truth, meaning, and purpose. Each week, we explore books that challenge how we see the world and help us grow intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually. So, if you've ever felt overwhelmed by the noise and you're looking for something that feeds your mind and nourishes your soul, you're in the right place. Today, we're diving back into Nexus, a brief history of information networks from the Stone Age to AI by Yuval Noah Harari. And this episode is all about the power of stories. We're unpacking how stories don't just explain the world, they shape it, and how fiction, not just fact, has been the glue of civilization. And as always, I'd love for you to drop your thoughts in the comment section as we go, because this isn't just content, it's conversation. Now, before we dive into the quotes, here's what this chapter is all about. You see, in chapter 2, Harari makes a bold claim. Stories, not just facts, are the real glue of human civilization. We're going to explore how stories have allowed humans to cooperate in large groups, build nations, create religions, start wars, launch economies, and even fall in love. You'll see how stories replace the need to personally know someone in order to trust them, how fiction often unites people faster and more effectively than truth, and how power throughout history has relied just as much on shared beliefs as it has on objective reality. We'll talk about religion, politics, passports, money, not to debate them, but to understand how they work as networks of shared imagination. And throughout it all, we'll ask the big question: what stories are we living in today, and are they still serving us? This chapter might challenge some of our assumptions. It might even shake a few things loose. But that's exactly what this space is for. So let's get into it. In chapter 20, the first quote on page 19 says, "Instead of building a network from human to human chains alone, as the Neanderthals, for example, did, stories provide Homo sapiens with a new type of chain, human to story chains. In order to cooperate, sapiens no longer had to know each other personally. They just had to know the same story." Let's break this down. Harari is saying that stories didn't just entertain us, they changed the rules of human connection. Other species like Neanderthals relied entirely on personal relationships. If you didn't know someone, you didn't trust them. And if you didn't trust them, you didn't cooperate. But then came us. Homo sapiens. We started building our communities around shared stories instead of shared bloodlines. Stories about gods, tribes, flags, money, laws. And just like that, we didn't have to know each other to trust each other. We just had to believe in the same story. That's what Harari means by human to story chains. And what Harari is saying here isn't ancient history. It's right now. Today, we don't just live in physical communities, we live in story-based networks. I mean, think about it. Political parties, stories, national identities, stories, religions, brands, even social movements are all stories. You can be in a room with strangers, but if you share the same belief in freedom, faith, family, or even a sports team, you instantly feel a sense of connection. That's the power of a shared story. It bridges the gap between I don't know you and I trust you. And that trust scales faster than any one-on-one relationship ever could. But here's the twist. Just because something unites us doesn't mean it's true. And just because we believe it doesn't mean we chose to believe it. That's why this matters. Because we're not just consumers of stories, we're shaped by them. For example, let's take something as simple as a passport. It's just a small booklet, thin pages, a photo, a few stamps. But if I hand it to a border agent halfway across the world, they'll open a gate for me. Why? Because we've all agreed globally that a passport equals identity, that this piece of paper holds legal and moral weight. They don't know me. They don't know my story, but they trust the story. They trust the idea of national borders, the story of citizenship, the narrative that this document represents. Now, take the same logic and apply it to something even more influential: money. A $100 bill isn't backed by gold, it's backed by belief. We believe it has value because everyone else believes it too. That's what gives it power. That's what makes it spendable. That's what allows millions of strangers to transact, invest, build, and grow without ever knowing each other. You see, money, like a passport, is a story, a shared hallucination, a collective agreement to assign meaning to paper, numbers, or digital code. And because we all buy into it, it works. This is what Harari means by the shift from human to human trust to human to story trust. It's not about who you know, it's about what you agree to believe. And those shared beliefs, they've shaped everything from economies to countries. See, for me, I didn't grow up with money, but I used to think money was real in the most literal sense. If I had it, I was winning. If I didn't, I was losing. In my world, money wasn't just about things, it was about survival. The money in your bank account was the scoreboard of your life. And honestly, no one around me ever challenged that narrative. You know, money equaled worth. And that was the story I grew up believing. I grew up to know that story. Then I majored in economics at the University of Southern California. And I got deep into financial systems and global markets. And my experience at USC laid the foundation for my understanding around how money works. And years later, in my book club, we read The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. This book cracked something open for me. Housel said, doing well with money has little to do with how smart you are, and a lot to do with how you behave. And that really sat with me because it forced me to confront something. Money isn't about logic. It's about emotions. It's about stories we inherit from our families, communities, cultures, stories about what money means. And then Harari came with the finisher. Money is the most successful story ever told. That's when it hit me. Money isn't backed by gold, it's backed by belief. We've all agreed to pretend that this piece of paper, this digital number, has power. And because we agree, it does. That realization was humbling. It reminded me that we don't just participate in the economy, we participate in a shared narrative about value, worth, and identity. Now, when I look at money, I don't just see dollars. I see trust. I see behavior patterns. I see the psychology behind the numbers, just like Housel wrote about. And I try to ask myself, is the story I believe about money still serving me? Or am I living inside of someone else's script? So the deeper thread here is this. Stories are the foundation for every system we trust. They don't just describe reality, they construct it. Whether it's money, citizenship, or your place in the world, you're living inside of narratives passed down from generation to generation. Some of those stories still serve you, some don't, but none of them are neutral. So here's the real opportunity. Start noticing the stories you've accepted. Start questioning the ones that limit you. Start writing new ones, stories built on awareness, intention, and trust. Because when we become conscious of the stories we believe, we gain the power to change the world we're building. On the second quote, we'll be on page 32. The author says, "In history, power stems only partially from knowing the truth. It also stems from the ability to maintain social order among a large group of people." Let's unpack that. Harari is challenging the idea that truth alone gives someone power. In reality, most of the most powerful individuals and institutions in history weren't just truth tellers. They were order makers. They knew how to keep people aligned, disciplined, and emotionally connected to a shared narrative. Sometimes that meant simplifying or bending the truth to protect stability. And this might sound manipulative, but it's more nuanced than that, because at the heart of it is a fundamental human need: order. That's what makes this quote so powerful. It helps us understand why truth isn't always what holds society together. Order is. And throughout history, religion has been one of the most effective tools humans have ever used to create that order. Religious stories have provided moral frameworks, social roles, rituals, and meaning, especially in times of fear, famine, war, or political uncertainty. They've given people hope when facts weren't enough. They've connected strangers through shared belief and not shared experience. But here's what the author points out, gently but clearly. Many of these stories weren't rooted in empirical truth. They were rooted in function. In other words, the goal wasn't always to explain the world with accuracy. It was to unite people with clarity and purpose. That's not a failure of religion. That's its brilliance as a human network. Because to maintain large-scale cooperation among millions of people, truth alone often isn't enough. What's needed is something that transcends logic, something that taps into belonging, into ritual, into identity. And for millennia, religion did just that. Sometimes beautifully, sometimes harmfully, but always powerfully. So when Harari says power comes from maintaining order, not just knowing truth, he's not just talking about empires or corporations. He's talking about belief systems that helped hold humanity together, especially when the truth was painful, unclear, or incomplete. To see this idea in action, we don't have to look much further than medieval Europe. For centuries, the Catholic Church wasn't just a spiritual guide, it was the central organizing system for society. The church provided laws, mediated justice, controlled education, and even legitimized kings. Monarchs didn't rule because they were the smartest or most strategic. They ruled by divine right, a story rooted in spiritual authority, not empirical truth. That's exactly what the author is pointing to. The church maintained order by offering meaning, purpose, and structure through stories. Whether those stories were literally true wasn't always the focus. What mattered was their ability to create social cohesion, to remind people of their place in the world, to preserve a system that kept millions of people aligned. And when that system was challenged during the Reformation in the 16th and 17th century, it wasn't just a battle over theology. It was a battle over information, over who gets to decide what's true and what's sacred. Because when you rewrite the story, you don't just threaten power, you threaten order itself. This idea hits home for me in a personal way. See, I was raised Christian. Church on Sundays, prayers before dinner. It gave me structure, values, a sense of right and wrong. It gave me order, the kind Harari talks about. And for me, most of my life, I didn't question it. It was just the story I lived in. But then I got to college, and I began to think for myself, and everything started to shift. I was struggling, not just academically, but mentally, emotionally. There were days where I felt completely disconnected from people, from purpose, even from myself. And in that space of silence, the old story wasn't reaching me like it used to. That's when I stumbled into something new. I discovered Buddhism, mindfulness, and this broader world of what people now call spirituality. And at first, I felt a sense of resistance. It felt like I was betraying something sacred. But the more I studied, the more I listened, the more I realized something profound. These stories, Christian, Buddhist, spiritual, they weren't enemies. They were different paths pointing toward the same truth. They all spoke of stillness, of compassion, of something greater than the self. And that moment changed everything for me. I stopped asking which story is right, and I started asking, what truth are they all trying to express? That's when I began to see story not as something to defend, but as something to decode. Because when you step outside the story you were raised with, just for a moment, you start to see how every belief system is trying to answer the same questions, just using different language. That's what this quote really means. That's what it's really about. See, power isn't just about facts. It's about the stories that create unity. We often think truth is the highest form of leadership, but what Harari shows us and what the author makes clear is that people will trade a complicated truth for a comforting story, especially if that story offers structure, purpose, and belonging. And whether we're talking about governments, religions, companies, or even friendships, we all have a role to play in maintaining the stories that keep our world in order. Sometimes those stories are helpful. Sometimes they need to be rewritten. But either way, understanding the why behind belief is the first step toward reclaiming your agency inside it. So, here's a question I have for you. What's a story you were taught to believe? Maybe about faith, family, or identity, that you've started to see differently as you've grown? What helped you shift your perspective? And what parts of that story still hold meaning for you today? Drop it in the comments. Your story might be the key that helps someone else unlock theirs. Now, let's move on to our third quote. On page 33, the author says, "When it comes to uniting people, fiction enjoys two inherent advantages over the truth. First, fiction can be made as simple as we like, whereas the truth tends to be complicated because the reality it is supposed to represent is complicated." He goes on to say, second, the truth is often painful and disturbing, and if we try to make it more comforting and flattering, it will no longer be the truth. In contrast, fiction is highly malleable. So, Harari's telling us something here that feels almost dangerous to admit. Fiction is better than truth at bringing people together. Crazy. Why? Because it's simple. And it can be shaped to meet our emotional needs. Truth, on the other hand, is complex, messy, and sometimes uncomfortable. So when we need unity, especially at scale, we often choose fiction. Not because we're foolish, but Because we're human. See, this is so important to understand because it explains why we fall for simple stories, even when we know the truth is more complicated. We're living in a time when attention is short and emotional intensity is high. So we gravitate toward narratives that are quick, easy, and clear. But clarity isn't the same as truth. In fact, most of the time, it's the opposite. The truth, it asks us to wrestle with contradiction, to hold multiple perspectives at the same time, to be okay not having all the answers. And let's be honest, that's exhausting. So we default to the simpler version, the headline, the slogan, the half-baked Instagram reel. And just like that, we're back in fiction. The real risk is this. When we reject complexity, we become vulnerable to manipulation. Not because we're weak, but because we're human. We want to belong. We want to feel safe. And fiction offers that much faster than truth. But that security can come at a cost. Our agency, our empathy, even our awareness. Again, you don't have to look far to see this dynamic in action. Just turn on the news or scroll on your social media feeds, and you'll see firsthand the political divide between Democrats and Republicans has become more than disagreement. It's become identity. Each side has its own language, its own heroes and villains, its own truth. But what the author reminds us is this. These aren't just facts we're clashing over. They're stories, crafted, simplified, and repeated until they feel real. And the truth, it's complicated. You can believe in stronger borders and compassionate immigration reform. You can value personal freedom and public health. You can support capitalism and question its excesses. But these kind of nuanced beliefs, they don't trend. They don't fit into headlines. They don't fire up the base. So instead, we get fiction. Red versus blue. Woke versus free. Us versus them. And over time, we stop talking to each other and we only talk about each other. That's not just politics. That's what happens when fiction replaces truth as the organizing force in society. And don't get me wrong, I'm guilty of it. There have been times when I've caught myself clinging to simple narratives, not because I wanted to ignore the truth, but because I was tired, confused, overwhelmed. It just felt easier to pick a side than to sit in the messiness. And I think we all do this, right? We all want to feel like we're on the right side. We want clarity. We want certainty. We want to know the facts. But if we're not careful, we start mistaking simple stories for complete ones. And then the stories that were meant to unite us start dividing us. So here's something to sit with. What's a belief you hold strongly, maybe politically, maybe personally, that you've never really questioned from the other side? Not to change your mind, but to strengthen it, to understand it better, to root it in something deeper than a reel or a headline. Because the moment we're willing to hold complexity is the moment we start reclaiming the truth beneath the story. Take a moment to journal privately or share in the comments, whatever feels right for you. And that brings us back to the heart of this episode's message. The stories we share don't just reflect reality, they create it. And the most powerful stories aren't always the ones that are true. They're the ones we choose to believe together. Fiction unites because it's simple. Truth divides because it's complicated. But if we want to build a world that's not just connected, but conscious, we have to be willing to ask hard questions about the stories we've inherited, not to shame them, but to understand them. Because once we understand the role story plays in shaping our networks, we can begin to shape those networks with more wisdom and more intention. And now for our last quote. On page 37, the author says, "To survive and flourish, every human information network needs to do two things simultaneously: discover truth and create order." Harari is naming the central tension at the heart of every society, every institution, every community, even every individual. We're constantly balancing two forces: the need for truth and the need for order. Too much truth and things fall apart. Systems are questioned, power is challenged, and instability grows. But too much order and we suppress truth, ignoring new ideas, hiding uncomfortable facts, and punishing dissent. The most resilient systems are the ones that can do both. Keep things coherent while staying open to discovery. And whether we realize it or not, we're all managing this tension every day, in our jobs, in our families, in our social circles, even in our inner lives. We want to know the truth, but we also want things to feel stable. Sometimes that means not asking the hard questions at work because we don't want to rock the boat, or staying quiet in a group chat when someone else says something questionable because we don't want to be seen as that person, or ignoring doubt about a belief we've always held because the truth might cost us relationships. But here's the thing. If we sacrifice truth for order, we lose the chance to evolve. And if we sacrifice order for truth, we lose the structure that holds us together. So the real challenge is, how do we do both? How do we stay rooted and open, grounded and curious, faithful to community, and honest with ourselves? That's the work. That's the stretch. And according to the author, it's the only way forward. This week, I invite you to notice where this balance shows up in your life. Is there a conversation, a belief, or even a decision where you're leaning too far into comfort or too far into disruption? And where can you practice honoring both truth and order at the same time? Now, this time, you don't just need to look at just governments or global crises to feel the tension between truth and order. Sometimes, all you have to do is look across the dinner table. How many of us were raised in families where certain things just weren't said, where expectations were clear but unspoken, where roles were assigned and questioning them felt like betrayal? Maybe it was your career, or your sexuality, or your faith, or the simple fact that you didn't want to be who they told you to be. And you didn't lie, you just stayed silent because the truth might have disrupted the entire system. That's what Harari means when he says every information network has to balance truth and order. In families, order can look like peace, but sometimes It's just unspoken tension. And when you start to grow into your truth, when you start to say, I don't believe that anymore, or that version of me isn't who I am now, you realize how fragile that order really is. It's not because your family is bad. It's because the systems they created were never built to hold your truth. That's the decision so many of us face. Do I keep the peace and lose myself? Or do I risk conflict to become who I really am? It's hard, it's timeless, and it's human. There was a moment in my life where the balance between truth and order completely unraveled. It was 2020, the world was locked down, and I watched the murder of George Floyd. Not in a movie, not in a war zone, but on my iPhone, on a regular Monday. And something in me broke. I sat there, still, angry, confused, grieving not just for what I saw, but for everything it represented. What hurt even more was what followed. A quiet unraveling of one of the closest friendships I'd ever had. He is a white man, and I'm a black man. And in that moment, we didn't argue. We didn't fight. There was just silence, text that went unanswered, calls that stopped coming, a friendship that faded. Because I was speaking a truth he didn't know how to hold for me. That was the cost of disrupting the order we had built together. And I was left with questions that didn't have clean answers. But I couldn't go back to pretending. So I did something different. I invited 5 friends to read the autobiography of Malcolm X with me. No agenda, just truth. And those conversations lit a fire in me. That's how the Seeds of Meaning book club was born. Out of heartbreak, out of stillness, out of the decision to stop prioritizing comfort over connection, and to create a space where truth didn't have to cost you belonging. That's exactly what Harari means when he says every human information network has to balance 2 things: discovering truth and creating order. But the truth, it's not always clean. It can fracture relationships, challenge traditions, expose things that we'd rather not see. Order, on the other hand, feels safe, predictable. But if it's built on silence or denial, it's fragile. The story of Seeds of Meaning wasn't just about starting a book club. It was about creating a new kind of order, one that had room for grief, honesty, and growth. One where truth didn't have to live in exile. And that's the opportunity for all of us to build networks, families, connections, communities, friendships, where both truth and order are honored. Not either or, but both and. So, question for you. Have you ever lost a relationship or felt a shift because you spoke a truth that disrupted the order around you? How did that moment shape you? And what kind of new order, new space, new community, new sense of self emerged from it? You can share in the comments or just sit with the question. Either way, just know you are not alone. So, here's what chapter 2 has taught us. 1, stories are what allow humans to form large-scale cooperation, not necessarily because they're true, but because they're shared. 2, fiction is powerful because it's simple and adaptable. Truth, on the other hand, is complex and often uncomfortable. And 3, every information network, from families to nations, walks a tightrope between truth and order. If we lose one, we eventually lose both. The invitation here is to stop thinking of truth and order as either or, and start seeing it as a practice of both and, something we return to, something we wrestle with, something we grow into individually and together. And of course, let's not just end the conversation here. Drop a comment and let me know. What's a story, belief, or truth that you've had to rethink recently? What triggered that shift? And how did it impact your life? And if you're looking for a space to go deeper into these conversations, join the Seeds of Meaning book club. It's a space where we honor both the intellect and the heart, where truth doesn't have to cost you connection. The link is in the description. Thank you for spending this time with me. This chapter reminded me, and maybe you too, that growth often starts with asking better questions, not having better answers. I hope you leave this episode a little more open, a little more grounded, and a lot more connected to your own evolving stories. If this spoke to you, subscribe, like, and send it to someone who's also on this journey. And join me next time as we dive into Chapter 3, Documents, the Bite of the Paper Tiger, where we explore how paperwork, bureaucracy, and forms shape the way power actually works. See you in the next one.